In a village nestled between rolling hills and sparkling streams, there lived a young woman whose presence seemed to illuminate the paths she walked. Her name was Amara, and she was known far and wide for her grace, her gentle manner, and the quiet wisdom that set her apart from her peers. But what drew the most attention and often stirred the hearts of those who could neither understand nor emulate her poise, was her dress, a garment unlike any other in the village. It was not merely a piece of clothing, it was a symbol of her dignity, her heritage, and the love woven into its very fibers. The dress had been crafted with immense care by her late mother, who had spent countless hours stitching delicate patterns into the fabric. Each thread told a story of protection, blessing, and lineage, carrying with it the quiet strength of generations of women who had walked the same paths and faced similar trials. The colors were rich and deep, shifting subtly in the sunlight, and the patterns were intricate, blending flowers, vines, and symbols meant to ward off misfortune. To the villagers, it was beautiful. To Amara, it was sacred, a tangible reminder of the guidance and love that her mother had left behind. She treated the dress with reverence, folding it carefully, wearing it on special occasions, and always walking with a sense of composure that seemed to elevate her beyond mere mortal concerns. The admiration of the villagers was immediate and widespread. Children would pause in their play to catch a glimpse of Amara walking through the village square, their eyes wide with wonder. Elderly women nodded approvingly, recognizing the patterns her mother had stitched, recalling the days when they too had worn garments imbued with care and meaning. Even men in the village, though respectful from a distance, could not help but notice how the dress seemed to accentuate her natural poise and elegance. It was a rare combination of beauty and dignity, of skillful craftsmanship and personal grace, that made her stand out amidst the common attire of the village. Yet, admiration is often a double-edged sword. Among those who watched Amara, there were whispers, small and secretive at first, that grew in both frequency and intensity. Envy is a subtle poison, creeping into hearts that cannot bear to see virtue unchallenged. Some villagers began to feel a restless dissatisfaction, a gnawing sense of inadequacy, when comparing themselves to her. They noticed her dress and its unmatched elegance and thought not of the care and love imbued in it, but of their own inability to possess such beauty or command such respect. They began to plot, quietly at first, imagining ways in which they could diminish her, to take from her the one thing that symbolized her dignity and the admiration she inspired. Despite these growing undercurrents of envy, Amara remained untouched by malice. She moved through the village with her characteristic serenity, offering smiles to children, helping neighbors with small kindnesses, and walking with an awareness of her surroundings that was both natural and mindful. She had learned from her mother that virtue is not to be flaunted, and that true strength lies in calm endurance, not in responding to jealousy with aggression. Even as eyes followed her, filled with desire or resentment, she bore herself with the quiet confidence of one who understands that the world cannot diminish what is fundamentally rooted in integrity and love. The dress, more than just fabric, seemed almost alive in its ability to reflect Amara's character. It hung from her shoulders with perfect symmetry, the threads moving gently with her every step, catching the sunlight and shadows in a way that seemed almost magical. It was a living emblem of her family's protection, a shield woven not only from cloth but from care, history, and a sense of moral purpose. And though envy was beginning to stir in the hearts of some, there was no denying that the dress was a symbol of more than outward beauty. It represented a lineage of strength, a legacy of protection, and an enduring reminder that virtue carries its own silent, formidable power. Thus, Amara walked through her village, radiant yet composed, admired yet envied, her dress a living testament to her mother's love and to the dignity that she herself embodied. The beauty of the garment and the grace of the wearer stirred hearts, inspired respect, and inevitably, planted the first seeds of jealousy that would later challenge the very fabric of her world. Yet even as envy began to take root, the dress, and the woman who wore it, remained untouchable, a quiet force of elegance, protection, and enduring virtue, waiting for the trials that would soon come to test its true power. As Amara continued her daily walks through the village, her elegance and the subtle glow of her cherished dress drew ever more attention. What had once been casual admiration began to shift in the hearts of certain villagers, morphing into a dangerous obsession. Among them were a handful of young women and men whose lives had been steeped in envy, their own accomplishments modest and their ambitions stifled by circumstances they resented. They watched Amara not with awe but with a growing irritation, a simmering desire to diminish what they could not attain. Every graceful step she took, every soft smile she offered to passers-by, seemed to fuel the fire of their jealousy, making them increasingly desperate to find a way to assert themselves, even at the expense of her dignity. The obsession with Amara's dress grew in quiet, conspiratorial whispers. "If only she could be humbled," one of the envious villagers muttered, his voice low, almost fearful that someone else might overhear. "Her beauty, her poise, it makes the rest of us seem small. If we could ruin the dress, she would be brought down to our level." Another chimed in, nodding in agreement. Her eyes narrowed as she thought of the perfect opportunity to humiliate the young woman who so effortlessly commanded respect. The words passed between them like sparks, igniting an unspoken plan that took root in their minds. In private corners of the marketplace, behind doors of small huts, and beneath the shade of ancient trees, these conspirators gathered to discuss their intentions. Each meeting was filled with whispered strategies, careful scheming, and a shared sense of purpose, though it was twisted and fueled by envy rather than righteousness. They spoke of opportunities to catch Amara unawares, to strike when her vigilance might falter. Some suggested that a simple tear in the fabric would serve as a public humiliation, a symbolic stripping of her elegance and status, while others imagined how such an act might cause her to stumble emotionally, perhaps even withdrawing from the admiration of the village. The threads of her dress, they believed, were the key to her influence, and if they could sever them, they could sever her standing among the people. Despite their plotting, they remained careful, knowing that open aggression would only fail and possibly bring consequences upon themselves. Each conspirator was mindful that Amara's demeanor, calm and observant, gave her an almost uncanny awareness of those around her. They whispered, they tiptoed, and they waited for the perfect moment, honing their plan like hunters lying in wait. The envy in their hearts was a dark fire, growing hotter with each day that Amara passed by, radiant and serene, seemingly untouched by the malice directed toward her. The conspirators' obsession went beyond mere jealousy of appearance. They began attributing mystical qualities to the dress itself, imagining that it endowed Amara with unseen advantages, a kind of protection or favor that they could not comprehend or acquire. This belief intensified their desire to act. "If we destroy the dress," one whispered in hushed tones, "then her power will fade. She will be like any of us." The statement, meant to bolster courage among the group, reflected the dangerous misconception that their malice could override the strength woven into the garment. In their eyes, the dress was not simply fabric and thread, it was a symbol, a representation of Amara's elevated status and the envy she inspired, and damaging it was the only way to claim superiority. Each member of the group grew increasingly consumed by their plans. They tracked her movements discreetly, observing where she might be alone or distracted. They spoke in coded phrases, sketching potential scenarios and rehearsing their actions in whispered conversations. Their obsession became all-consuming, coloring every thought and turning admiration into a dangerous compulsion. They were no longer merely envious. They were determined, convinced that tearing the dress would assert dominance, humiliate Amara, and satisfy the dark hunger in their hearts for power over her. Yet, even in the midst of their plotting, there remained a sense of unease. Some felt a faint hesitation, a whisper of conscience that suggested the young woman's dignity could not be harmed so easily. But envy is a potent blindfold, and the conspirators ignored the warnings, focusing instead on the imagined glory of their forthcoming act. Every stolen glance at the dress, every observation of Amara's serene composure, only strengthened their determination to execute the scheme they had nurtured in secret. The threads of fate were beginning to stir, though they were unaware that the very fabric they sought to destroy held its own power, a force that would soon turn their envy into inescapable consequence. The day the conspirators had long planned arrived with a clear, bright sky, the sun casting golden light over the village as though celebrating the ordinary peace they were about to disrupt. Amara moved through the square, her dress flowing with elegance, each step measured and graceful, as villagers went about their daily routines. Children played along the edges of the market, and elders exchanged greetings while tending their small shops. The conspirators lingered at a distance, eyes fixed on her, hearts pounding with a mix of anticipation and nervousness. They had rehearsed their actions countless times in whispers and shadows, yet the reality of the moment made their pulses race faster, driven by the intoxicating lure of envy and the imagined triumph of their forthcoming deed. As Amara approached the fountain at the center of the village, a place where gossip often thrived and eyes were plentiful, the conspirators decided it was the perfect spot to carry out their malicious act. They moved quickly, converging from different sides, their hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. One of them, a girl with sharp eyes and a tense jaw, lunged forward with the intent to grab the hem of Amara's dress. Another followed, twisting and tugging at the delicate fabric. The sound of ripping threads echoed faintly, drawing gasps from nearby villagers who paused, unsure of how to intervene. The attack was deliberate, coordinated, and cruelly public. Every movement designed to provoke shame and fear, to assert dominance over the young woman they resented so deeply. Amara, however, did not cry out. She did not stumble. She did not even flinch. Her hands, calm at her sides, betrayed none of the surprise or pain that the conspirators had hoped to elicit. She turned her gaze to them, eyes steady, and in that moment, the crowd could see that she was utterly composed, unmoved by their assault. The malicious energy of the attack, intended to reduce her to humiliation, seemed instead to bounce off her with no effect. Her presence radiated an almost imperceptible aura of calm that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy of her attackers. Villagers, initially shocked, began to sense that something unusual was unfolding, that this was no ordinary incident of bullying or petty cruelty. As the dress was pulled and stretched, something extraordinary began to happen. The threads, delicate and intricate as they were, seemed to respond to the intent behind the attack. A subtle tension vibrated through the fabric, as if it recognized the malice directed toward it. Where the attackers expected weakness, they encountered an invisible resistance. The dress, imbued with the love and care of Amara's mother, began to move almost imperceptibly, tightening around the arms of those who had tried to harm it. It was subtle at first, a faint pressure that caused a momentary pause, but it quickly became undeniable. The dress was protecting its wearer, responding to the greed and cruelty in the hearts of the attackers. Panic flickered across their faces as the threads wrapped more firmly, binding their fingers and twisting like living strands. They struggled, pulling and tugging, expecting that force alone would sever the fabric or free their hands. But the threads clung, unyielding and purposeful, as though guided by a will beyond their understanding. Whispers rippled through the crowd as bystanders began to notice the unnatural movement of the dress. Murmurs of astonishment and fear spread, the villagers realizing that what they had assumed to be a simple garment was something extraordinary, something that could not be violated without consequence. Amara, in her serene composure, did not speak. She remained standing, her posture straight and dignified, embodying the calm strength that had always defined her. The conspirators' eyes, wide with disbelief and terror, darted from her to the dress and back again, as the realization dawned that their malicious act had not succeeded in harming her. It had only ensnared them in their own cruelty. The threads, responding to intent rather than mere physical manipulation, continued to wrap and twist, a quiet but undeniable justice taking form. By the time the struggle ended, the attackers were left tangled, frightened, and humiliated, their intended victim untouched and still radiant in the flowing fabric of her dress. Villagers looked on, their admiration for Amara deepening, their fear of the consequences of envy beginning to settle in their minds. The young woman's dignity, so long admired, had not only endured an attack but had transformed it into a moment of revelation. Her virtue and the protective power of her dress were forces far beyond the petty malice of those who sought to undermine her. The villagers who had tried to humiliate Amara were left trembling, caught in the grip of something far beyond their understanding. The dress, which to the untrained eye seemed nothing more than exquisite fabric adorned with delicate patterns, revealed its true nature in that fateful moment. Every thread was more than mere fiber. It was imbued with generations of care, love, and protection, stitched not just with skill but with intention. Her mother had poured not only her hands but her spirit into the garment, embedding blessings and safeguards into every intricate design. The dress had always been a symbol of dignity and grace, but now, under the assault of envy and malice, it revealed itself as a living, vigilant protector, capable of discerning intent and responding with precision. The threads, woven with unseen power, reacted almost as if they possessed consciousness. They could feel the greed and cruelty directed at them, the malicious desire to destroy what was sacred, and they responded accordingly. With a subtle hum, a tension that was invisible yet undeniable spread through the fabric. Where the attackers had pulled with brute force, the threads coiled around them, sensing the animosity in their hearts. It was not a chaotic reaction but a deliberate, calculated response. The dress moved to protect Amara while simultaneously holding the wrongdoers accountable. The threads acted with an almost sentient awareness, their movements guided by the imbalance between the innocent and the malicious. This power, though mysterious, was deeply connected to the wearer's integrity. Amara's calm composure and her unwavering virtue provided a stabilizing influence on the dress, enhancing its protective qualities. Her grace was like a compass for the threads, directing them to act against those who intended harm while leaving her completely unharmed. It was as if the dress could distinguish between malevolent intent and innocent interaction, a subtle intelligence embedded in its very fibers. This intelligence, nurtured through generations of protective stitching and blessing, ensured that Amara's dignity could never be diminished by envy or cruelty. The attackers' struggle intensified as they realized that their strength alone could not overcome the dress. Every tug and pull only caused the threads to respond more firmly, weaving themselves around their hands, twisting and coiling as though alive. They were trapped not by brute force, but by a deliberate and calculated reaction that mirrored their own malicious intentions. The fabric, far from passive, seemed to enforce a silent law. Those who sought to harm the innocent would face consequences precisely proportional to their malice. This mystical response was both frightening and awe-inspiring, revealing a hidden dimension to what had seemed like a simple garment. Villagers who witnessed the scene were struck by a mixture of fear and reverence. Some whispered that the dress had been enchanted by Amara's mother, that it was blessed by unseen spirits who watched over the girl. Others speculated that it was a manifestation of Amara's own virtue, that her unwavering patience and moral strength had awakened a protective force within the threads. Whatever the truth, all who saw it understood that this was no ordinary clothing. The dress had become an extension of Amara herself, a visible and tangible symbol of the unseen power that virtue could summon in the face of envy and cruelty. Even as the attackers struggled, the threads remained calm and deliberate, not driven by mindless fury but by a quiet, unwavering sense of justice. Each movement was precise, ensuring that harm came only to those who intended to do harm, sparing Amara entirely. The threads acted as both shield and instrument of retribution, embodying the idea that malice, when directed toward innocence, inevitably encounters resistance far beyond what the aggressor anticipates. The dress's power was subtle yet undeniable, an almost mystical equilibrium that maintained the balance between the innocent and those who would seek to diminish them. By the time the struggle concluded, the attackers were left battered, bound, and humiliated, their initial intent utterly defeated by the living threads. The villagers' awe grew, their fear tempered by admiration for both Amara and the protective garment she wore. It was a revelation that went beyond mere spectacle. It was a lesson in the power of intention, the unseen strength of virtue, and the protective force that can reside in the most unexpected of forms. The dress had spoken, acted, and defended, ensuring that Amara remained unscathed, her dignity intact, and her enemies undone by the very malice they had sought to impose. The moment the dress responded to the attackers' malice, a shiver of dread passed through them. They had expected fear, shame, or perhaps a verbal reprimand from Amara, but nothing could have prepared them for the strange, almost otherworldly sensations that now gripped them. The threads they had so callously tugged and pulled began to move independently, slithering along their arms and legs with a life of their own. It was as if the fabric had sprouted consciousness, sensing the intent behind every motion and twisting accordingly. Panic surged through the group as they realized that they were no longer in control. The dress had seized authority over the very hands that sought to harm it. At first, the effects were subtle. Fingers tingled, wrists felt a gentle constriction, and a shiver ran up their spines as though invisible hands were probing, testing, and assessing. They laughed nervously, attributing the sensations to nerves or coincidence, trying to convince themselves that there was nothing unnatural occurring. Yet as moments passed, the threads began to coil more firmly, winding themselves around arms and legs with a deliberate, almost serpentine precision. Each constriction was neither violent nor reckless. It was purposeful, a measured response to the malice they carried. Attempts to free themselves only resulted in tighter binding, and with each struggle their terror deepened. The aggressors' initial bravado crumbled as the threads climbed, slithered, and tightened. Their shouts for help echoed through the village square, mingling with gasps from onlookers who were too shocked to intervene. Some tried to pull forcefully at the dress, hoping to tear it free, but the threads clung stubbornly, resisting their every effort. Every attempt to assert dominance over the garment only increased its hold, as if it were guided by an unseen hand ensuring that no harm could come to Amara. The attackers' own malicious intent seemed to fuel the dress's power, transforming their envy and cruelty into a tangible, binding force. Eyes widened as the threads coiled around wrists and ankles, moving with uncanny precision, wrapping the aggressors in patterns that resembled intricate bindings rather than random tangles. There was a hypnotic quality to the movement, a silent intelligence that suggested both protection and judgment. The villagers who witnessed the scene felt a mixture of awe and fear. Whispers spread quickly, some claiming that the dress was enchanted by Amara's mother, others insisting that it was a manifestation of divine justice. Every observer could sense that this was no ordinary garment and that Amara herself was somehow shielded by forces far beyond human understanding. As the threads continued to respond, the aggressors' panic intensified. They writhed and twisted, trying to pull free, but each movement only seemed to tighten the coils around them. Their fear was palpable, eyes darting frantically, breaths coming in shallow gasps. The dress, with its mystical qualities, moved not with chaos but with a deliberate precision, binding them in a way that was terrifyingly methodical. Every twist of the threads mirrored the intentions of those who had sought to harm the innocent, ensuring that justice was exacted without unnecessary cruelty to the wearer. The first consequences were clear. Envy and malice had tangible repercussions, and the dress had become the instrument through which justice was administered. The aggressors could no longer deny the supernatural force at work. Their laughter, once cruel and confident, had vanished, replaced by terror, confusion, and a deep, gnawing understanding that they had underestimated the power of what they sought to destroy. The dress's ability to sense intent and act accordingly transformed the event from a simple act of theft or humiliation into a profound lesson. Cruelty carries a weight, and the threads of justice, though invisible until provoked, are inexorable. As the villagers watched, the initial aggressors struggled helplessly, ensnared by threads that seemed to coil with intelligence, their punishment proportionate to their malice. Amara stood unaffected, serene and dignified, her calm presence contrasting sharply with the chaos unfolding around her. The first consequences had been meted out, signaling the beginning of a reckoning that would extend beyond a single day. The thread's eerie, almost serpentine movements hinted at the deeper forces at work, a supernatural justice forming that could not be ignored or evaded. Those who had intended harm were now learning, in a most inescapable way, that malevolence directed at the innocent carries its own peril, a lesson that would resonate far beyond this single incident. The initial shock of the thread's strange and binding behavior quickly gave way to full-blown panic among the aggressors. What had started as a malicious, confident act now turned into a nightmare from which they could not awaken. Their fingers were trapped, wrists encircled by the dress's living threads, and ankles similarly ensnared. Every attempt to pull free only resulted in tighter coils, as if the very fabric sensed each movement and adjusted accordingly. The thread's intelligence was undeniable. They were no longer merely protecting Amara, they were actively enforcing a silent, calculated justice. "Let go! Let go!" shouted one of the young men, thrashing violently. His cries reverberated through the village square, mingling with the astonished gasps of the onlookers. Yet the threads responded only by tightening slightly, slithering with a precision that was almost mocking in its deliberateness. It was as though they could distinguish between random panic and intentional cruelty, punishing only the latter while remaining entirely harmless to Amara, who stood silently observing. The aggressors' faces turned pale, their eyes darting between each other in frantic desperation, realizing that their usual tactics, strength, intimidation, or cunning, were utterly useless against this living fabric. Confusion spread among them, their thoughts unraveling faster than the threads that bound them. They tried to discard the dress, to tear it away, even to cover themselves in shame, but the garment seemed to defy every attempt. No matter how they twisted or turned, the threads remained wrapped around them, responding to the malicious intent they had directed at Amara. Each movement they made seemed only to empower the fabric further, reinforcing the invisible grip that held them in place. Their initial confidence, the boldness that had driven them to attack, dissolved entirely, replaced by fear, disbelief, and a dawning realization that they were caught in forces far greater than themselves. The villagers who witnessed the scene were equally affected. Some shrank back in terror, certain that they were seeing an act of divine intervention, while others whispered theories of magic and curses. "It's the dress," one whispered, eyes wide. "She can't be harmed and it's punishing them." Others speculated that Amara's mother had woven protections into the garment, blessings that came alive whenever malice approached. Regardless of the explanation, a collective sense of awe and fear spread through the crowd, further isolating the trapped aggressors in both physical and social terms. Attempts to flee were met with immediate resistance from the threads. As one tried to sprint toward the village gate, the threads tightened around his ankles, throwing him off balance. Another attempted to rip the garment off entirely, but the fibers seemed to extend and coil like serpents, anchoring him in place. Every desperate movement only increased their entrapment, transforming the simple act of binding into a calculated orchestration of justice. Panic escalated as they realized the futility of their efforts. There was no escape from a force that sensed intent, only from surrender and humility. Voices rose in terror, mingling with curses and cries for mercy. They turned on one another in desperation, blaming their peers for the predicament, but the threads remained impartial, responding solely to the collective malice and envy directed toward Amara. It was a lesson in balance and inevitability. Those who act from cruelty cannot outrun the consequences, no matter how clever or strong they may believe themselves to be. Each coil of the fabric, each constriction and slither, reinforced the truth that the innocent are protected by forces beyond ordinary understanding, and that justice, however silent, is inescapable. Amara herself remained composed, a calm center amid the storm of panic and confusion. Her serenity accentuated the chaos around her, emphasizing the futility of cruelty and the potency of virtue. The thread's response was both warning and punishment, demonstrating that malice directed at the innocent carries a heavy, unavoidable price. The aggressors' fear had grown to desperation, their confusion total. They were bound not just by fabric, but by the revelation that they had underestimated the power they sought to destroy. The village watched, awestruck and cautious, as the threads held fast, signaling that the lesson of justice was only beginning and that any further malice would meet the same relentless, supernatural response. The threads of Amara's dress, now fully awakened to the malice of the aggressors, began a final, deliberate movement. What had started as subtle coiling and binding escalated into a complete and terrifying enveloping of those who had sought to harm her. The threads, infused with unseen power, wound tightly around arms, legs, and torsos, moving with an almost intelligent precision that left no part of the perpetrators' bodies unbound. It was as if the fabric itself were a living entity, executing judgment with methodical patience and unwavering determination. The villagers watched in stunned silence, their collective breath caught between awe and fear, as the wrongdoers were slowly transformed from bold aggressors into helpless captives, wrapped like coffins in threads that were neither ordinary cloth nor mere adornment. Every attempt to escape, to tug at the fabric or break free, only tightened the grip of the living threads. The material responded to every gesture of malice with exacting precision, its movements deliberate, almost surgical in their accuracy. Wrists and ankles were bound in spirals, the coils thickening as they moved upward, climbing over shoulders and across chests, ensuring that the captives were completely enveloped. Each movement of the threads was not driven by haste or fury, but by a quiet, resolute sense of justice. The more the aggressors struggled, the more the threads resisted, reinforcing the inexorability of consequences when cruelty is directed toward the innocent. The visual effect was chilling. The wrongdoers were encased entirely, their faces barely visible, their bodies immobilized, yet not broken. They resembled coffins more than people, silent testaments to the power of intention and the certainty of retribution. The villagers whispered among themselves, their voices hushed with reverence and terror. Some swore the threads had a life of their own, a spirit bound to protect Amara and punish those who sought to diminish her. Others speculated that Amara's virtue had awakened the hidden power of the garment, turning a simple attack into a profound lesson on morality, integrity, and justice. As the threads continued their enveloping motion, the atmosphere in the village square grew heavy with awe. Children who had come to watch the spectacle held their parents' hands tightly, sensing that something extraordinary was unfolding. Elder villagers exchanged solemn looks, recognizing the story that would eventually be told for generations, a story of virtue, protection, and the inescapable consequences of malice. The threads moved deliberately, wrapping around every limb and torso, creating intricate patterns that resembled both artistry and imprisonment. Each coil was a statement. Cruelty, when aimed at the innocent, will always encounter resistance, and that resistance is neither random nor capricious, it is a reflection of cosmic justice. The aggressors, for their part, were gripped by terror and disbelief. Their eyes darted frantically, searching for any possible weakness in the threads, any escape route, but none presented itself. Every twitch, every futile tug only resulted in tighter bindings, the threads acting as if aware of their every thought and intention. The sensation was suffocating yet precise, an exacting mirror of the malice that had led them here. Panic deepened as they realized that there was no external force to blame. It was the very fabric of the dress, intertwined with centuries of blessing and protective intent, meting out punishment in response to the darkness of their hearts. Amara stood apart, her posture serene and composed, radiating an almost imperceptible authority. She did not gloat, she did not shout. She simply allowed the threads to perform their work, her calm presence reinforcing the protective and judgmental energy of the garment. Her dignity contrasted starkly with the terror of those ensnared, emphasizing the lesson that virtue and patience hold power far beyond immediate perception. The threads had not only protected her, they had delivered the full measure of justice, visibly and unequivocally demonstrating that malevolence has consequences that cannot be avoided or ignored. By the time the wrapping was complete, the wrongdoers were entirely immobilized, encased like living coffins, a spectacle that left no doubt in the minds of the villagers that Amara's dress was no ordinary garment. It was a vessel of justice, a living testament to the principle that cruelty toward the innocent provokes consequences that are both inevitable and inescapable. The visual of the fully wrapped aggressors, helpless and fully bound, ensured that the lesson would linger in every mind. Envy and malice are dangerous forces, and the virtuous, though appearing delicate, often possess protection far beyond comprehension. In that moment the village learned a profound truth. The threads of the dress, responding to intent rather than mere action, had executed a judgment as precise as it was inevitable. The aggressor's punishment was neither random nor unjust. It was the direct consequence of their own cruelty, brought to life through the mystical power of the garment. The threads, having fully enveloped those who had sought to harm Amara, seemed to pulse with quiet satisfaction, a tangible manifestation of unseen justice, leaving the young woman untouched, radiant, and untouched in her dignity. The spectacle that unfolded around Amara left the villagers in a state of awe and apprehension. They had gathered initially out of curiosity, expecting perhaps gossip, conflict, or petty rivalry, but what they witnessed far surpassed anything they could have imagined. The aggressors, fully ensnared by the living threads of Amara's dress, were now completely immobilized, writhing helplessly, their panic and fear radiating outward. Every coil of the threads, every slithering movement, seemed purposeful and deliberate, an unmistakable manifestation of judgment against malice. As the villagers observed, they felt the weight of the lesson being delivered and began to understand the consequences of envy and cruelty in ways words alone could not convey. The initial reaction was disbelief. Mothers clutched their children to their sides, fearing for the young woman who had been the target of such malevolent intent. Some villagers gasped audibly, covering their mouths in shock, while others whispered prayers under their breath, unsure whether they were witnessing magic, divine intervention, or a manifestation of some ancestral protection. Elders exchanged knowing glances, recognizing in the scene echoes of old cautionary tales, stories of moral order and supernatural justice long whispered across generations. Every eye in the village was fixed on the young woman, and with each passing moment, the weight of her calm dignity contrasted ever more sharply with the chaos engulfing those who had sought to harm her. Gradually, awe began to mingle with a profound respect. Even those who had not been directly involved in the attack felt the power of the dress's supernatural response, and more importantly, the strength of Amara's composure. She stood untouched, serene, and unshaken, embodying a virtue that demanded acknowledgement. Villagers began to murmur among themselves, conversations laced with reverence and caution. "See how she stands," one elder said quietly, "unaffected by their cruelty. Perhaps she is protected by something beyond our understanding." Another whispered to her neighbor, "It is not the strength of her arms but the strength of her spirit that shields her." These words spread like a soft wind across the crowd, reinforcing a growing recognition that envy and malice are forces fraught with peril. Children, usually drawn to spectacle for amusement, watched in tense silence. They understood that the threads were not mere fabric, but something imbued with power and judgment. Some pointed quietly at the immobilized aggressors, whispering about how their envy had led them into a trap from which there was no escape. Parents nodded, seizing the moment to instill lessons of morality and caution. "Do you see what happens when one harms another?" they whispered to their children. "Even small acts of cruelty carry consequences." The display became an immediate moral lesson, tangible and unforgettable, demonstrating that malevolent intent toward the innocent provokes inevitable reckoning. Fear also grew among the villagers. Many had underestimated the young woman, some even doubting her strength and virtue. Yet witnessing the thread's precise and intelligent action, they realized that Amara was not only protected but empowered in ways that human understanding could scarcely explain. The aggressor's panic reflected the danger inherent in envy and cruelty, and the villagers themselves recognized that any attempt to harm the young woman would be equally futile. Respect was tinged with fear, a dual acknowledgement that Amara's presence carried both moral authority and supernatural protection. Even those who had previously dismissed her as weak or insignificant now viewed her with cautious admiration. The elders, who traditionally served as the moral compass of the village, stepped forward to articulate what everyone was feeling. "Let this be a lesson," one said in a steady voice, "that cruelty toward the innocent invites consequences beyond our reckoning. Malice is never without price, and virtue is often shielded by forces unseen. His words, measured and solemn, resonated with the villagers, crystallizing the spectacle into a moment of communal understanding. The thread's actions were a vivid, undeniable testament to that truth, a physical demonstration of justice that left no room for denial or misinterpretation. As the immobilized aggressors continued to struggle in vain, the villagers' perspective shifted from mere observation to a deeper, almost reverential comprehension of justice and morality. They began to see that the young woman's calm composure was inseparable from the power that protected her, that virtue, patience, and integrity are not passive traits but forces that attract unseen allies and enforce consequences for wrongdoing. Stories began to form in their minds, the events of the day destined to become cautionary tales, recounted around hearths and during communal gatherings for years to come. By the time the threads had fully encased the wrongdoers and the initial panic had reached its zenith, the village had collectively internalized the lesson. Envy and malice had been met with immediate, visible repercussions, while Amara's dignity remained intact. Respect for her grew steadily, mingled with a cautious fear of her presence and what it symbolized. No one doubted her integrity, nor the extraordinary protection surrounding her. The events transformed the village's social consciousness, leaving a lasting impression that would shape behavior, attitudes, and morality for generations. In witnessing the extraordinary scene, the villagers recognized that the balance between virtue and envy is delicate, yet inviolable. The threads of the dress had acted as arbiters of justice, and Amara, in her calm and dignified state, embodied the ideal of the protected and righteous. From that day forward, she was not merely a young woman in the village, she was a symbol of the consequences of cruelty, a living testament to the potency of virtue, and a figure worthy of both reverence and respect. Years passed, and the events surrounding Amara and her extraordinary dress became woven into the very fabric of village memory. The story of the living threads, the aggressors ensnared like coffins, and Amara's unshakable calm transformed into a cautionary tale repeated around hearths, marketplaces, and schoolyards. Parents recounted it to children, elders to young adults, each retelling emphasizing the central truth. Harming the innocent, coveting what is sacred, or acting from envy and malice carries consequences beyond human comprehension. The village had learned a lesson so vividly demonstrated that it could not be forgotten. The dress, once a simple garment, had become a symbol of protection, virtue, and inescapable justice. As the years went by, the story took on layers of legend and moral significance. Mothers would warn their children not to be envious of others, telling them, "Remember Amara's dress. Envy wraps tightly around those who seek to harm the innocent, just as the threads bound the aggressors." Teachers used the tale to impart lessons on integrity, patience, and moral courage. The living threads of the dress, though a singular event, had become emblematic of the principle that virtue attracts protection, and that wrongdoing, even small acts of cruelty, cannot escape retribution. The narrative was no longer simply about a young woman and her garment. It had become a universal lesson on morality, justice, and the unseen forces that guard those who act with goodness. Amara herself continued to live with quiet dignity, never flaunting her past or the power that had saved her. She maintained her composure, her calm demeanor a constant reminder of the lesson she embodied. Her dress, once ordinary, had transformed into a relic of moral significance. It was revered not only for its supernatural power but for the integrity it represented. Villagers would speak of it with respect, often pausing in her presence to honor her steadfastness and the story that had ensured their own understanding of right and wrong. Over time, the tale of the dress was incorporated into festivals, songs, and teachings, ensuring that each new generation would grasp the gravity of malice and the safety found in virtue. The aggressors' fate became a permanent memory, and their punishment a warning etched into the collective consciousness. Even long after the events had occurred, villagers would recall the terror they had seen, the writhing, binding threads, the helpless panic of those who had sought to humiliate Amara. Their suffering became a cautionary example. Envy and cruelty have a way of returning to the hands of the perpetrator, and no one, no matter how clever or strong, could escape the consequences when the moral order itself seemed to intervene. Stories emphasize that justice, though sometimes subtle and slow, is inexorable. The threads were a tangible manifestation of this truth, and the dress, a symbol that moral wrongdoing is never without price. Over time, the dress inspired not only fear but admiration. Young women in the village learned to see it as a symbol of strength, patience, and resilience. Its story reminded them that true protection lies not only in magical or supernatural means but in steadfast virtue and moral courage. The narrative reinforced the understanding that dignity and integrity are forces in themselves, capable of evoking justice in unexpected ways. The dress, with its living threads, became a metaphor for the idea that those who act with righteousness may appear fragile, yet possess a power that protects and enforces consequences on their behalf. Amara's calm presence, preserved in the memories of those who witnessed the events, further strengthened the legacy. She became a model of what it meant to endure cruelty without losing one's sense of self or moral clarity. People spoke not only of the supernatural phenomena but of the lessons in patience, restraint, and dignity that Amara embodied. Her story emphasized that true justice does not require aggression or retaliation. It manifests in the preservation of virtue and the inevitable correction of wrongdoing. The threads of her dress were seen as the ultimate manifestation of this principle, binding the malevolent while leaving the innocent untouched. As decades passed, the story transcended the boundaries of the village. Neighboring towns and distant regions heard of Amara and the miraculous dress. It became a legend, a tale recounted to instill morality, caution against envy, and reverence for virtue. The image of the dress's threads wrapping the aggressors like living coffins endured in the imagination of storytellers and listeners alike, symbolizing the certainty of justice. The villagers taught their children that when one acts with cruelty, greed, or malice, unseen forces, like the threads, may intervene to restore balance. Amara's tale became not just a local story, but a moral compass for an entire region. Even in modern recountings, the dress retained its symbolic potency. It came to represent the intertwining of protection, justice, and virtue. The legend emphasized that morality carries intrinsic power, and that the innocent are shielded by forces that operate beyond human perception. Amara's dignity, her unwavering composure, and the miraculous actions of her dress were remembered as an enduring lesson. Envy and cruelty are dangerous, virtue is protective, and justice, whether manifest through supernatural means or moral consequence, is inescapable. The dress remained a timeless emblem, a reminder that harming the innocent or taking what is sacred will always result in consequences, sometimes in ways that cannot be predicted, yet are always certain.